3 minutes ago, I signed the order, and with that signature, every Western-controlled silver mine on our soil stopped belonging to the past and started belonging to the future. There was no applause in the room, no shouting, no celebration, just silence. Because this was not an emotional decision, it was a final one. The weight of history. For decades, Africa has been told to wait. Wait for development, wait for investment, wait for permission. We waited while our land was measured in spreadsheets, while our mountains were drilled, our rivers poisoned, our people underpaid. We waited while silver left our soil richer than it arrived, and our nation stayed poor. Today, the waiting ended. But this moment did not arrive suddenly. It arrived after generations of extraction, after centuries of being told that Africa's role in the global economy was to provide, not to prosper. It arrived after watching other nations build their futures on resources they took from our ground while we were left with holes in the earth and promises that never materialized. Look across this continent and you will see the pattern repeating itself like a drumbeat that never stops. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the world's largest producer of cobalt, the very mineral powering the electric vehicle revolution, the mineral that every Western technology company needs to meet their climate targets, the government finally said enough. In 2025, after watching cobalt prices collapse to 9-year lows while foreign companies continued to extract billions of dollars worth of resources, the DRC implemented an export ban that sent shockwaves through global supply chains. When they lifted that ban in September 2025, it wasn't a return to business as usual. It was replaced with something far more significant, a quota system that will last through 2027. The DRC now controls approximately 75% of global cobalt trade flows, not through violence, not through rhetoric, through sovereignty. They capped 2025 exports at just over 18,000 metric tons. They imposed a 10% royalty that must be paid within 48 hours of shipment. They created compliance certificates that every exporter must obtain before a single gram leaves Congolese soil. This is what reclaiming control looks like in practice. West Africa's awakening. Mali understood this lesson too. In December 2025, the Malian government announced something that made international mining executives sit up straight in their boardrooms. They had recovered over $1.2 billion in unpaid taxes and royalties from mining companies. $1.2 billion. Let that number settle in your mind. This wasn't money stolen through nationalization. This was money owed, money that belonged to the Malian people all along, money that mining companies had somehow failed to pay while extracting Mali's gold. The recovery came after a comprehensive audit in 2023 that revealed major payment gaps that had existed for years while foreign companies called their operations in Mali partnerships and investments. The audit led to a new mining code that fundamentally restructured the relationship between Mali and the companies operating on its soil. Royalties increased, state ownership expanded, and perhaps most importantly, the long-term stability clauses that had locked Mali into unfavorable terms for decades were removed. This wasn't aggression, it was accounting. Burkina Faso watched what Mali did and drew its own conclusions. Throughout 2024 and 2025, Burkina Faso pursued what international media nervously called aggressive nationalization. In August 2024, they acquired the Bongu and Wanyan gold mines for $80 million, mines that had been valued significantly higher but were purchased at terms Burkina Faso set, not terms the sellers preferred. By June 2025, they completed the nationalization of 5 gold mining assets, transferring them to the country's state-owned miner through official decree. When West African Resources achieved first gold production at their Kiaka mine in June 2025, celebrating this milestone as a triumph of foreign investment, the Burkina Faso government made a request that froze the company's stock, increased the government's stake from 15% to 50%. International observers called it shocking. The Burkinabe government called it fair. After all, who decided that 15% was the appropriate share for the country actually containing the gold? Later, in September 2025, Burkina Faso clarified that the increased stake was optional, not compulsory. But by then, the message had been received by every mining company operating in West Africa. The terms of engagement had fundamentally changed. Africa was no longer accepting whatever percentage foreign companies decided to offer. Africa was setting its own terms. The silver standard. Let me be clear, this is not about silver alone. Silver is only the proof. Proof of a system where Africa digs and others decide. Proof of a model where extraction is called partnership and obedience is called stability. Proof that wealth can leave a country every day while dignity never arrives. For years, Western companies came with contracts thicker than history books. They promised jobs. They promised technology. They promised progress. What they delivered was control. They set the prices. They controlled the refining. They exported the value. And when Africa asked questions, they called it political risk. In 2025, Gabon formalized what many African nations had been thinking but hadn't yet codified into law. A Gabonese mining decree classified certain minerals as sovereign substances due to their economic and strategic importance. The list was specific: gold, silver, uranium, rare earth elements. These weren't just minerals anymore, they were declared sovereign, belonging fundamentally to the nation, requiring special terms for any exploitation, mandating government participation not as charity but as right. The decree established that the state would maintain a systematic 35% participation right in any project involving these sovereign substances. Not negotiable, not optional, systematic. This wasn't radical ideology. This was baseline sovereignty, the kind of sovereignty that Western nations take for granted when managing their own strategic resources, but somehow find concerning when African nations assert the same. They said, "This is how the market works." But I asked myself a simple question that no one seemed willing to answer honestly. If this market is fair, why is Africa still poor? If this system is balanced, why do our children dig while their shareholders dine? If this arrangement is voluntary, why does it feel permanent? China's different calculus. While Western companies complained about resource nationalism and political risk, China made a different calculation. They understood something that the West refused to acknowledge: that genuine partnership produces better returns than grudging extraction. By December 2025, China had gained what analysts called a dominant position in Africa's critical minerals sector, not primarily through political pressure, but through long-term investments in mining and refining capacity. China imported nearly $10 billion worth of minerals from sub-Saharan Africa in 2023 alone, but unlike Western companies that extracted ore and shipped it away for processing, China increasingly invested in African refining capacity, in battery manufacturing plants, in the infrastructure that allows African nations to move up the value chain. When Zimbabwe banned raw lithium ore exports in 2022, then extended that ban to all raw mineral ores in 2023, Chinese companies responded by investing in processing facilities within Zimbabwe itself. This created a fascinating dynamic: African nations asserting sovereignty over their resources, and Chinese companies adapting to that sovereignty rather than fighting it. Meanwhile, Western mining executives called these same sovereignty measures deterrents to investment and warned of an exodus of foreign capital. But the exodus never came. The investments shifted, the terms changed, but the mining continued, because everyone understood the fundamental truth that Western companies didn't want to admit. They needed Africa's resources more than Africa needed their specific companies. The International Energy Agency projected that lithium demand will grow fivefold by 2040, graphite and nickel demand will double, demand for cobalt and rare earth elements will increase by factors that require opening dozens of new mines to meet. And where are these minerals? In Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo holds 56% of global cobalt reserves. South Africa has 92% of platinum. Madagascar, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. The continent holds the keys to the energy transition that Western nations claim is existential, the cost of waiting. So today, I answered those questions with action. Every Western-controlled silver mine is closed, not paused, not renegotiated, closed, no extensions, no emergency exemptions, no quiet side deals. The era of extracting Africa without respecting Africa is over. Consider what waiting has cost us, not in abstract economic terms, but in real human consequences measured across generations. Consider the schools that were never built because mining revenues disappeared into offshore accounts. Consider the hospitals that lack equipment because royalty rates were set so low that African governments couldn't afford basic public services. Consider the young people who grew up in the shadow of massive mining operations yet had to leave their communities to find decent employment because the mines employed foreign technicians for skilled positions and locals only for dangerous, low-wage labor. Tanzania reformed its mining regulations in 2017, increasing royalties and demanding greater state participation. It was not a radical overhaul. It was a measured attempt to correct obvious imbalances in agreements that had been signed decades earlier under very different circumstances. International mining companies launched investment arbitration proceedings against Tanzania, arguing that the changes violated their rights under existing agreements. They hired elite law firms and filed claims in international tribunals, deploying the full machinery of international investment law to punish Tanzania for daring to renegotiate terms that had locked the country into perpetual disadvantage. But whose rights were violated when those original agreements gave Tanzania less than 10% of the value extracted from its own ground? Who speaks for the Tanzanian communities that watched trucks carry gold out of their region while their children attended schools with dirt floors and no textbooks? Who arbitrates on behalf of the Tanzanian workers who contracted lung diseases in the mines but received no long-term health care because the mining company's obligations ended at the minimum required by contracts written in their favor? The arbitration proceedings dragged on for years, costing Tanzania millions in legal fees, money that could have built infrastructure, funded education, provided health care. This is part of the cost of waiting. Not just the wealth that never arrived, but the wealth actively drained away defending the right to fair terms against companies that had already extracted billions. Zambia's story reveals an even deeper tragedy. Sitting atop some of the world's richest copper deposits in the Copperbelt region it shares with the southern DRC, Zambia spent decades as one of Africa's largest copper producers while remaining one of its poorest nations. The copper left Zambian soil as ore, got refined elsewhere, got manufactured into products elsewhere, got sold for massive profits elsewhere, and Zambia received a small fraction of that value chain, usually just the mining royalty and some employment. Walk through the copper belt today and you see the paradox in physical form. Massive mining operations extract copper worth billions annually, yet the surrounding communities lack reliable electricity. The power lines run past their homes to the mines, which have guaranteed supply, while residents experience blackouts that last days. The roads leading to the mines are well maintained because the companies need them for heavy equipment, but the roads leading to schools and clinics are rutted dirt tracks that become impassable in the rainy season. This is not accidental. This is the deliberate structure of an extractive system that optimizes for resource removal, not community development. The mining companies built exactly the infrastructure they needed to extract copper efficiently: roads to transport ore, power for their operations, housing for their managers, and nothing more. They fulfilled the letter of their contractual obligations, which were written to require as little local investment as possible, and they called this economic development. The cost to Zambia has been astronomical, not just the lost revenue from refining, manufacturing, and value-added processing that happened elsewhere, but the compounding effect of decades where that wealth could have built industrial capacity, educated a workforce, created economic diversification. Instead, Zambia remained dependent on copper exports, vulnerable to global price fluctuations, unable to develop alternative industries because all economic policy was oriented toward keeping mining companies satisfied. When copper prices crashed, as they periodically do, mining companies laid off workers and reduced operations, and the Zambian government faced fiscal crisis because it had allowed its economy to become so dependent on mining revenue that represented only a tiny fraction of the value its resources generated. When copper prices rose, the mining companies' profits soared, but Zambia's share increased only marginally because the royalty rates were fixed and the value-added processing happened elsewhere. This is what waiting costs: the opportunity to build an economy instead of just operating an extraction site. Uganda discovered significant critical mineral deposits in recent years and immediately faced the question every African nation with natural resources must answer: extract now under unfavorable terms or wait for better terms while other countries benefit from supplying global demand. The pressure to extract immediately is enormous. International mining companies arrive with proposals and promises. Development finance institutions offer loans contingent on mining development. Other countries with similar deposits are already extracting and gaining revenue, even if that revenue is a fraction of what it should be. Too often, African nations were pressured into the former by the argument that waiting meant losing out to competitors. Mining executives would warn that if Uganda didn't approve the project under the proposed terms, the company would simply invest in a similar deposit in another country, and Uganda would get nothing. Better to receive 10% of something than 100% of nothing, the argument went. But what this argument deliberately ignored was that the resources aren't going anywhere. They're in African ground. It's not a competition between African nations to race to the bottom offering the most favorable terms to foreign companies. It's a negotiation between Africa and companies that have alternatives but still need what Africa has. The lithium in Zimbabwe doesn't become less valuable if Zimbabwe waits 6 months or a year to sign a mining agreement. The cobalt in the DRC doesn't disappear if the Congolese government demands better terms and the initial company walks away. Another company will come because the cobalt is still there and the world still needs it. The cost of not waiting, of accepting unfavorable terms out of fear of losing investment, has proven far higher than the cost of patience, because once you sign a mining agreement giving away 70 or 80% of the value of your resources for 20 or 30 years, you're locked in. The resources are extracted during that period. They're gone, and you received a fraction of what you should have received because you were told that waiting wasn't an option. Uganda, to its credit, has been more cautious than many African nations before it. The government has studied what happened in Zambia, in Tanzania, in the DRC. They've seen how mining agreements signed hastily under pressure became millstones around the necks of African nations for decades. They've learned that the companies threatening to walk away usually come back with better terms when they realize African nations are serious about demanding fair deals. And if one company walks away permanently, there are others ready to negotiate more reasonably. This is the lesson that African nations are finally learning collectively. Waiting has a cost, but accepting exploitation has a higher cost. The resources are finite. Once they're extracted, they're gone. Extracting them quickly under bad terms doesn't serve African development. It just transfers African wealth to foreign shareholders more rapidly. Consider the environmental cost of waiting too long to assert control. Mining operations conducted under weak regulatory frameworks, with minimal government oversight and maximum corporate freedom, have left environmental devastation across Africa. Tailings ponds that leak toxic chemicals into groundwater, open pit mines that destroy agricultural land and are never properly rehabilitated after closure, rivers polluted with mining waste that make them unusable for drinking, fishing, or irrigation. In many cases, the mining agreements gave companies the right to extract with minimal environmental safeguards, and when the mines eventually closed, the companies walked away, leaving the environmental cleanup to African governments that lacked the resources to undertake it. The communities remained, living with polluted water and poisoned soil, while the profits from decades of mining had long since been transferred abroad. This is another dimension of what waiting cost. The time during which environmental destruction proceeded unchecked because African governments had signed away their regulatory authority in exchange for mining investment that benefited those governments minimally. Had those nations waited, negotiated better terms, maintained stronger regulatory control, the mining could have proceeded in ways that didn't leave permanent environmental scars. The human cost is hardest to quantify but most important to understand. In the DRC, artisanal cobalt miners work in dangerous conditions, tunneling into unstable earth with minimal safety equipment. Because the formal mining sector controlled by foreign companies employed relatively few locals in well-paid positions. The bulk of employment went to dangerous artisanal mining that the formal sector depended on, but didn't directly control or take responsibility for. Children worked in these mines because their families had no other options for income. International outcry about child labor in cobalt mining prompted some reforms, but the fundamental structure remained unchanged. The people living atop the world's most valuable cobalt deposits were desperate enough to risk their lives and their children's lives for minimal income because the wealth generated by that cobalt flowed elsewhere. This is what waiting cost in human terms. Generations of African children who grew up in poverty surrounded by wealth, whose labor was exploited to extract resources that powered technology in wealthy nations, who died in mining accidents or developed chronic health conditions for wages that couldn't lift their families out of poverty. The cost of waiting is also measured in infrastructure never built. Mining agreements typically require some infrastructure development, roads to transport ore, power supply for operations, sometimes housing for workers. But this infrastructure serves the mine, not the broader community. When the mine closes, the infrastructure often deteriorates because it wasn't integrated into national infrastructure planning. It was built for extraction, not development. Imagine if instead, African nations had demanded from the beginning that mining revenues be invested in national infrastructure that would outlast any individual mine, rail networks connecting regions and facilitating trade, not just ore transport, power grids serving communities, not just mining operations, ports capable of handling diverse cargo, not just mineral exports, education systems producing engineers and geologists and metallurgists, not just mine laborers. This infrastructure would have created the foundation for economic diversification, for industrial development, for long-term prosperity. The mining revenues could have built it if those revenues had been captured appropriately, but because African nations waited too long to demand fair terms, the revenues were too small to fund transformative infrastructure investment, and the infrastructure that was built served extraction rather than development. The cost compounds across generations. The children who grew up without quality education because mining revenues were too small to fund good schools became adults without the skills to demand better employment. The communities without hospitals saw higher mortality rates and lower life expectancy, reducing the human capital available for development. The nations without infrastructure couldn't attract diverse investment beyond resource extraction, remaining locked into dependence on mining. Each generation that lived under exploitative mining agreements passed to the next generation an economy more dependent, less developed, more vulnerable than it should have been given the resource wealth beneath their feet. This intergenerational theft, stealing from future generations the benefits of resources extracted in the present, is perhaps the highest cost of waiting. And throughout all of this, African nations were told that this was normal, that this was how mining worked, that they should be grateful for the investment. They were told that demanding better terms was unrealistic, that threatening foreign investment, that scaring away capital. They were told to wait for development to arrive through trickle-down effects from mining investment. They waited. Development didn't arrive. The mining companies prospered. Their shareholders received dividends. Their executives received bonuses. Their home countries received tax revenue. And the African nations containing the actual resources remained poor. The pattern of plunder. Let me address the reaction before it arrives, because I know it already has. Phones are ringing in capital cities across Europe and North America. Ambassadors are requesting urgent meetings, their talking points already prepared by foreign ministries coordinating a response. Newsrooms are calling this reckless, bringing out the same economic analysts who always materialize to warn that African nations asserting sovereignty over their resources will destabilize markets and harm their own interests. Markets are shaking, with silver futures already moving as traders price in supply disruptions. They will say I am destabilizing supply chains that were carefully constructed over decades to ensure reliable resource flows. They will say I am threatening global industry that depends on stable access to African minerals. They will say I am playing politics with minerals that should be governed by market forces and international contracts. They will dust off the language they always use when African nations challenge the extractive system: reckless, unstable, dangerous, short-sighted. But let's talk about what they called these same actions when they weren't taken by African nations. Let's examine the double standard that reveals the true nature of the international resource governance system. When the United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, mandating that battery minerals must be sourced from the U.S. or free trade partners, effectively cutting China out of American supply chains and requiring a complete restructuring of electric vehicle manufacturing, they called it strategic planning. The law provided hundreds of billions in subsidies and tax credits conditional on using approved mineral sources, fundamentally reshaping global mining investment. It was economic nationalism on a massive scale, using the power of the American market to dictate where mining investment would flow and which countries would benefit. Did international observers call this reckless? Did they warn that America was destabilizing global supply chains? Did they caution that playing politics with critical minerals would harm American interests? No. They called it smart policy, appropriate protection of national interests, strategic thinking for the 21st century economy. When the European Union crafted its Critical Raw Materials Act, identifying strategic materials and creating preferential partnerships to secure supply, effectively creating a two-tier system where preferred partners received investment and market access while others faced barriers, they called it economic security. The EU openly stated its goal was reducing dependence on China for critical minerals by creating alternative supply chains under European control or strong influence. This meant telling mining companies where to invest, which countries to partner with, which supply chains to build. Did anyone call this destabilizing? Did economic analysts warn that Europe was threatening global industry? Did ambassadors from affected countries receive sympathetic hearings when they complained about being shut out of European markets? No. It was accepted as the natural right of the European Union to structure its resource access in ways that served European interests. When Australia restricted foreign investment in its mining sector through its Foreign Investment Review Board, blocking Chinese companies from acquiring certain Australian mining assets and requiring approval for foreign investment in critical minerals, they called it national interest. Australia explicitly used national security concerns to limit foreign control of its mineral resources, rejecting investments that would have brought billions in capital but would have given foreign entities control over Australian resources. Did international institutions condemn this? Did mining companies successfully argue that Australia was violating free market principles? Did the World Trade Organization intervene to force Australia to accept foreign investment? No. It was understood that Australia had the sovereign right to control its own resources and determine who could invest in its mining sector. But yesterday, when silver left our soil for a fraction of its value, they called it business. When our workers earned pennies while profits crossed oceans, they called it efficiency. When Africa remained dependent on extracting raw materials while importing finished products at markup, they called it stability. When Western companies structured mining agreements to minimize African government revenue and maximize their own profits, they called it standard practice. So do not lecture me about responsibility. Responsibility is knowing when enough is enough. Responsibility is recognizing that a system that keeps one party perpetually disadvantaged while calling it partnership is not sustainable. Responsibility is acting to correct injustice even when that action creates short-term disruption. The historical pattern is clear and consistent, and it reveals the machinery of neo-colonial extraction that replaced formal colonialism after African nations gained independence. In the 1960s and 1970s, when African nations first achieved independence, many attempted to nationalize their mining sectors to reclaim control over resources that colonial powers had exploited for decades. These nationalizations were based on simple logic. Resources within a nation's borders should benefit that nation's people, and the extreme extraction agreements signed under colonial rule should not bind independent nations. Those nationalizations were met with economic sanctions designed to strangle the nationalizing nations' economies, capital flight as foreign companies pulled out not just from mining but from all sectors, deliberately creating economic crisis, diplomatic isolation as Western nations coordinated to exclude nationalizing African nations from international institutions and trade agreements, and in some cases, covert destabilization, supporting opposition groups, funding coups, actively working to overthrow governments that asserted sovereignty over their resources. The most notorious example was the 1960 assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, killed months after independence because he insisted that Congolese resources should benefit Congolese people. The Congo contained vast mineral wealth, copper, cobalt, diamonds, gold, uranium, and Western powers, particularly Belgium and the United States, were determined that an independent Congo would not control those resources in ways that disadvantaged Western access. Similar patterns played out across Africa. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, who promoted Pan-African resource governance and challenged Western economic dominance, was overthrown in a coup while traveling abroad in 1966. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, who promoted economic self-sufficiency and challenged the extractive relationship with former colonial powers, was assassinated in 1987. The message was clear: African leaders who seriously challenged Western control over African resources faced consequences. African nations were taught through these examples that asserting sovereignty over their resources would result in punishment from the international community. The punishment would be economic, sanctions, capital flight, exclusion from markets. It would be diplomatic, isolation, blocked from international institutions, denied development assistance, and it could be violent, coups, assassinations, civil wars that mysteriously received foreign support that sustained conflict. So a different model emerged, a model of neo-colonial extraction that maintained the substance of colonial-era resource exploitation while adopting the language of partnership and development. African nations would negotiate with foreign companies from a position of weakness, accepting whatever terms maintained the flow of foreign investment. They would prioritize extraction over development, believing the promise that export revenues would eventually fund broader development. They would hope that the benefits would materialize even though the structure of the agreements ensured that most value flowed abroad. Decades later, the raw materials are still leaving African soil in massive quantities. The foreign companies are still profiting enormously from African resources, and African nations that should be wealthy beyond measure based on their natural resources remain trapped in cycles of poverty and dependence that the resource extraction was supposed to end but instead perpetuated. This is the pattern of plunder dressed up as partnership. Mining agreements structured to give foreign companies overwhelming advantages were called joint ventures. Royalty rates set at a fraction of resource value were called market rates. Environmental regulations weakened to attract investment were called competitive policies. Opposition to exploitative terms was called anti-business sentiment. And African leaders who accepted these arrangements were rewarded with international legitimacy, development assistance, and personal enrichment, while leaders who challenged them faced the consequences. The pattern persists to this day, adapted for the modern era, but fundamentally unchanged. Instead of formal colonial control, there are mining agreements locked in for decades. Instead of colonial administrators, there are corporate executives. Instead of explicit extraction, there is transfer pricing and offshore subsidiaries that legally move profits out of African jurisdictions. Instead of gunboat diplomacy, there are investment arbitration proceedings and threats of capital flight, but the result remains the same: African resources enriching others while Africa remains poor. And when African nations finally challenge this system, they are told they are being irresponsible, destabilizing, threatening the global order. The global order built on African poverty is presented as something African nations have an obligation to maintain. This is what ends today. The pattern ends. The plunder ends. The pretense that this system serves African interests ends. We are done negotiating from weakness, done accepting terms designed to disadvantage us, done waiting for promised benefits that never materialize. The new reality. Here is the new reality, and let me state it with absolute clarity so there is no misunderstanding. If you want Africa's silver, you do not dictate terms to Africa. You do not arrive with contracts written by your lawyers in your language protecting your interests and expect African governments to simply sign. You do not decide prices based on calculations made in London or New York or Sydney that devalue the resource to minimize what you pay. You do not set production schedules that optimize your operations without regard to our development needs. You do not extract wealth and leave poverty, take resources and leave holes, operate mines and leave communities. You come to Africa as a partner or you do not come at all. From this moment forward, any access to our resources follows three non-negotiable rules. These are not starting positions for negotiation. These are baseline requirements for any company that wants to operate in our territory. Companies that accept these terms are welcome. Companies that don't accept these terms are not welcome. There is no middle ground, no compromise position, no special exceptions. First, ownership begins here. Not shell companies registered in tax havens with no actual presence or substance, existing only to shift profits away from African tax jurisdiction. Not offshore structures designed to minimize tax obligations and maximize profit repatriation while making it impossible to determine who actually benefits from the mining. Not complex corporate arrangements where a subsidiary of a subsidiary operates the mine while profits flow through multiple jurisdictions to end up in places that don't tax them. Here. If you want to extract African resources, your company will have significant African ownership that isn't just nominal but represents real equity stakes and real profit sharing. Your board will include African members with genuine authority, not token appointments with no real power, but directors who participate in actual decision-making about operations, strategy, and profit distribution. Your decision-making about significant issues, production levels, environmental practices, employment policies, community engagement, will happen in consultation with African stakeholders who have real input, not rubber stamp approvals after decisions have already been made. This means African governments, African investors, and African citizens will benefit directly from mining operations through ownership stakes that give them a share of profits, not just royalty payments that give them a fraction of revenue. It means decisions about mining operations will be made by boards that include people accountable to African interests, not just corporate executives accountable only to foreign shareholders. It means transparency about who benefits from mining, with no hiding behind complex corporate structures. Second, value stays here. Processing, refining, and pricing will no longer be exported with the ore in a system designed to capture all value-added activity in foreign jurisdictions, while leaving Africa with only the lowest value part of the supply chain. The days of shipping raw materials abroad and buying back finished products at markup are over. The days of mining agreements that prohibit or discourage local processing to ensure foreign control of refining are over. The days of pretending that Africa lacks the capacity for processing when the real reason processing happens elsewhere is to capture that value abroad are over. If you mine silver in Africa, you will refine that silver in Africa. You will employ African metallurgists who learn and apply refining techniques. You will employ African engineers who design and operate processing facilities. You will employ African technicians who maintain sophisticated equipment. You will build the infrastructure for processing, refineries, processing plants, quality control laboratories, so that when silver leaves African soil, it leaves as a finished product commanding finished product prices, not raw or sold at the lowest possible valuation. This requires investment in African processing capacity, technology transfer so that African engineers understand the processes, and training programs that create skilled African workforces. It means that instead of exporting ore worth X and importing finished products worth 10X, Africa exports finished products and captures that value multiplication. It means that the jobs created include high-skilled, high-wage positions in processing and refining, not just low-skilled, low-wage positions in mining. And it means pricing will reflect actual value. No more transfer pricing schemes where the mining subsidiary sells ore to the refining subsidiary at artificially low prices to shift profits out of African jurisdiction. No more opaque pricing formulas where African governments can't determine whether they're receiving fair value. Transparent pricing based on actual market value of the resources extracted, with African participation in price setting and verification. Third, respect is non-negotiable. No threats against African governments that assert their sovereignty. No pressure campaigns using home country governments to apply diplomatic coercion against African nations that demand better terms. No ultimatums that African nations must accept your terms or face consequences. No more treating African governments like obstacles to be managed rather than partners to be respected who have legitimate interests that deserve consideration equal to your corporate interests. No more lobbying Western governments to apply diplomatic pressure when African nations assert their rights. We know this happens. Mining executives meet with foreign ministry officials and request that their government apply pressure on African governments to maintain favorable terms. Ambassadors deliver messages that changing mining agreements will harm bilateral relations. Development assistance gets conditioned on maintaining favorable mining terms. This is neo-colonial pressure, and it ends now. No more funding opposition groups or supporting political instability when the current government insists on fair terms. We know this happens too. Mining companies fund political opposition, support civil society groups that challenge governments trying to reform mining agreements, and sometimes go further into actively supporting destabilization when governments become too assertive about sovereignty. This is interference in African domestic politics to serve foreign corporate interests, and it will no longer be tolerated. No more of the quiet coercion that has characterized resource extraction in Africa for generations, the implicit threats that asserting sovereignty will result in capital flight, that demanding fair terms will scare away all investment, that Africa needs foreign companies more than foreign companies need African resources. This coercion relied on African nations believing they had no alternative, no leverage, no ability to survive without accepting unfavorable terms. That belief was always false, and African nations no longer believe it. Respect means recognizing that African governments have legitimate authority over their territory and resources. Respect means negotiating in good faith rather than using superior resources and legal capabilities to extract maximum advantage. Respect means accepting that African interests deserve equal consideration to your corporate interests. Respect means that when an African government says these are our terms, you either accept them or walk away, but you don't threaten, pressure, coerce, or undermine. This is not punishment, it is balance. It is the baseline of how resource extraction should have always worked: mutual benefit, genuine partnership, shared prosperity. The fact that these terms sound radical reveals how imbalanced the previous system was. In a fair system, these wouldn't be radical demands. They would be obvious baseline expectations. The fact that they seem radical shows how accustomed we've all become to a profoundly unfair system. The bigger picture. And for those watching from outside Africa wondering how serious this is, let me remove all doubt. This is not a message for one country. It is a signal to the world. Africa is not poor. Africa has been priced cheaply. Africa is not weak. Africa has been trained to kneel. Africa is not dependent. Africa has been managed into dependency. That management ends now. Look at what's happening across this continent and recognize that it's not isolated incidents. It's a continent-wide recalibration. This is not one angry leader making an impulsive decision. This is not an aberration that will be corrected when cooler heads prevail. This is a fundamental shift in how Africa relates to its resources, and it's happening simultaneously across dozens of nations because the logic is irrefutable and the moment has arrived. Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso formed the Alliance of Sahel States in September 2023, explicitly coordinating their approaches to resource governance and collectively negotiating with foreign companies. This wasn't primarily a military alliance, though security cooperation was part of it. At its core, it was an economic sovereignty alliance, three nations deciding that they would coordinate rather than compete, that they would present unified positions rather than allowing foreign companies to play them against each other, that they would share information about contract terms and support each other in demanding better deals. When one nation in the alliance changes its mining code, the others watch carefully and often implement similar reforms. When Mali recovered that $1.2 billion in unpaid taxes, Burkina Faso and Niger took note and launched their own audits. When Burkina Faso nationalized mining assets, Mali and Niger examined their own agreements with renewed scrutiny. This is not coincidence. This is strategy. This is African nations finally understanding that their leverage increases exponentially when they coordinate rather than compete. The alliance sent a clear message to mining companies: you cannot escape fair terms by moving from one country to another. If Mali demands higher royalties, you cannot simply shift investment to Burkina Faso and get better terms because Burkina Faso is coordinating with Mali. If one country refuses to allow tax avoidance through offshore structures, the neighboring country in the alliance will refuse the same thing. The race to the bottom is over because the countries decided to stop racing. Ghana renegotiated multiple mining agreements throughout 2024 and 2025, increasing royalty rates and demanding greater transparency in how mining revenues are calculated and reported. Ghana is one of Africa's largest gold producers, and for decades it followed the standard model: favorable terms for foreign companies, minimal government revenue, promises of development that partially materialized at best. The government finally conducted a comprehensive review of its mining sector and concluded what should have been obvious: Ghana was receiving far less benefit from its gold than it should. The renegotiation wasn't confiscatory, it wasn't revolutionary, it was simply adjusting the terms to something approaching fairness. Royalty rates increased from levels that had been set decades ago and never adjusted for inflation or increased gold prices. Transparency requirements meant the government could verify what companies were reporting about production and revenue. Environmental standards increased to protect communities from mining pollution. Mining companies protested, as they always do when terms change in Africa's favor, but they continued operating because ultimately mining gold in Ghana at fair terms was still profitable. It was just less extremely profitable than mining gold at exploitative terms. And Ghana demonstrated something important: that African nations could renegotiate agreements and the sky wouldn't fall, investment wouldn't entirely disappear, and economic development would continue, now with more revenue staying in Ghana to fund it. Tanzania continued the reforms it began in 2017, refusing to back down despite international pressure and arbitration proceedings. The arbitration cases against Tanzania were meant to serve as a warning to other African nations: change the terms and face expensive legal consequences. Mining companies have discovered that investment arbitration is an excellent tool for disciplining African governments that assert sovereignty. File a claim for billions in an international tribunal, and suddenly the African government faces years of legal proceedings, massive legal bills, and the possibility of an enormous judgment that must be paid. But Tanzania refused to be intimidated. They defended the arbitration cases, and more importantly, they didn't reverse the reforms while the cases proceeded. They calculated correctly that the long-term benefit of fair mining terms outweighed the short-term cost of arbitration proceedings. And they sent a message to other African nations: you can resist, you can defend your sovereignty in these tribunals, and you can prevail, or at least make the cost of challenging you high enough that companies think twice before automatically filing arbitration claims. Madagascar, Mozambique, and South Africa have all, in various ways, asserted greater control over their critical mineral resources. South Africa, despite its relatively more developed economy and longer history of significant mining sector regulation, still found it necessary to reform its mining codes because even the existing regulations were insufficient to ensure that the country's mineral wealth adequately benefited its people. Madagascar, with significant graphite deposits crucial for battery manufacturing, began demanding that companies invest in local processing rather than simply extracting and exporting raw graphite. Mozambique, with substantial mineral resources including graphite, copper, and heavy mineral sands, increased scrutiny of mining agreements and began rejecting proposals that didn't include sufficient local benefit. Even nations that haven't implemented dramatic nationalizations have changed the conversation fundamentally. They're asking harder questions during contract negotiations, questions that weren't asked before or were asked but not pressed when companies provided unsatisfactory answers. What percentage of profits will remain in our country after all your corporate structures and transfer pricing? How many of your senior positions will be held by our nationals, and on what timeline? What specific infrastructure will you build beyond what directly serves the mine? What technology will you transfer, and how will you train our engineers? What happens to the mine site after closure, and who pays for environmental rehabilitation? They're demanding better terms and refusing to accept the first offer or the second or the third. They're creating competition among mining companies by making it clear that companies willing to accept fair terms will get access while companies insisting on exploitative terms will not. They're using the urgency of the global energy transition, which requires African minerals, as leverage to demand better deals now, because they understand that their minerals are more valuable than ever, and this is the moment to assert control. They're requiring local content in serious, enforceable ways. Not vague promises of hiring locals for unskilled positions, but specific requirements for manufacturing, processing, employment of nationals in senior and technical positions, with penalties for non-compliance. They're insisting on technology transfer so that African engineers learn the advanced techniques that foreign companies have long kept proprietary, building African technical capacity that will outlast any individual mining project. They're conditioning mining licenses on commitments to local infrastructure development, roads, schools, hospitals, electricity grids, with the infrastructure specifications negotiated as part of the mining agreement and compliance monitored by government inspectors. So that mining creates genuine development, not just holes in the ground and company towns that become ghost towns when the mine closes. Zimbabwe's 2022 ban on raw lithium ore exports exemplifies the shift in African thinking. Zimbabwe has substantial lithium deposits that global markets increasingly need for electric vehicle batteries. Under the old model, Zimbabwe would have exported raw lithium ore, and the processing, refining, and battery manufacturing would happen elsewhere, with Zimbabwe receiving only the mining royalty on the raw ore's value. Under the new model, Zimbabwe is asserting, lithium mined in Zimbabwe gets processed in Zimbabwe, creating higher value employment and capturing more of the value chain. Mining companies initially predicted the ban would devastate Zimbabwe's lithium sector by scaring away investment. Instead, what happened was that companies adapted. Chinese companies in particular made substantial investments in lithium processing facilities within Zimbabwe because they understood that access to Zimbabwe's lithium required accepting Zimbabwe's terms. The lithium sector in Zimbabwe grew despite, or perhaps because of, the export ban, because the ban forced a restructuring of investment toward higher value activities. This pattern is repeating across Africa. Companies predict catastrophe when African nations assert sovereignty. The catastrophe doesn't materialize. Companies adapt. Investment continues under fairer terms, and the African nation captures more value from its resources. This is teaching African governments that they have more leverage than they believed, that standing firm produces better results than capitulating, that companies' threats to walk away are usually bluffs because the resources are valuable enough that someone will accept fair terms even if a particular company won't. The leverage Africa holds. I know what comes next because it's already starting to happen even before the full implications of today's closure are understood. They will warn of sanctions, trade restrictions, investment barriers, exclusion from markets, designed to punish us for asserting sovereignty and to serve as a warning to other African nations. They will hint at isolation, diplomatic marginalization, blocking from international institutions, withdrawal of development assistance, attempting to make us pariahs for demanding fair treatment. They will try to divide African nations by fear, offering better terms to countries that don't follow our example while threatening consequences for those that do, hoping to prevent African coordination by making each nation believe it's safer to defect from collective action than to maintain solidarity. But fear no longer works when you have already lost everything except your dignity. And let me speak directly to my brothers and sisters across this continent, to the leaders making similar calculations, to the citizens demanding that their governments assert sovereignty, to the next generation that will inherit whatever we build or fail to build. This moment is bigger than silver, bigger than one mine, bigger than one country. Today it is silver, tomorrow it is gold, lithium, uranium, cobalt, copper, manganese, chromium, platinum, rare earth elements, graphite, nickel, tantalum, every mineral that the modern world needs, that the energy transition requires, that technology depends on. The question is not whether Africa has leverage. The question is whether Africa remembers it, whether Africa uses it, whether Africa finally capitalizes on what has always been true. The world needs what Africa has more than Africa needs any particular company or country to extract it. Consider the numbers that should terrify Western policymakers but somehow don't yet, because they still believe Africa can be pressured into maintaining the old arrangements. Africa holds 92% of global platinum reserves, platinum that's essential for catalytic converters that reduce vehicle emissions, hydrogen fuel cells that represent one possible clean energy future, medical equipment including pacemakers and cancer treatment drugs, industrial processes for chemicals and petroleum refining, and jewelry that represents billions in annual trade. Without African platinum, vast sectors of the global economy would face immediate disruption. Africa holds 56% of global cobalt, cobalt without which the electric vehicle revolution simply cannot happen at scale. Every electric vehicle battery requires cobalt. Energy storage systems for renewable energy require cobalt. The International Energy Agency's projections for meeting climate targets depend on massive increases in cobalt supply, virtually all of which must come from Africa because that's where the cobalt is. Companies are desperately seeking ways to reduce cobalt content in batteries or develop cobalt-free alternatives, but those technologies remain future possibilities, not present realities. Right now and for the foreseeable future, electrification depends on African cobalt. Africa holds 36% of global chromium, essential for stainless steel production and therefore fundamental to construction, transportation, household goods, and industrial equipment. 54% of global manganese, crucial for steel production and battery manufacturing. These aren't luxury goods. These are necessities for modern industrial civilization and the clean energy transition that every government claims is essential. When China began restricting rare earth element exports in 2010, threatening to cut off supplies to Japan during a diplomatic dispute over contested islands, global markets panicked and governments scrambled. Rare earth elements are crucial for everything from smartphones to wind turbines to precision-guided missiles. Their name is misleading. They're not particularly rare, but they're difficult and environmentally damaging to process, and China had cornered the market by being willing to accept the environmental costs while other countries offshored that processing. China's willingness to use its rare earth dominance as geopolitical leverage sent every major economy scrambling to secure alternative supplies and restart domestic processing despite the environmental challenges. Emergency funding flowed to rare earth projects outside China. Strategic reserves were established. The entire episode demonstrated how vulnerability in critical mineral supply chains creates unacceptable strategic risk for nations dependent on those minerals. Yet China only controls about 70% of rare earth processing capacity, not the underlying resources. Africa holds substantial rare earth deposits that have been underexplored precisely because it was cheaper and easier to buy from China than to develop African sources under terms that respect African sovereignty. If African nations demanded fair terms for rare earth development, would global markets simply accept dependence on China rather than pay fair prices to Africa? Or would they reluctantly accept that African rare earths at fair terms are strategically preferable to Chinese rare earths that come with geopolitical strings attached? The answer is obvious. They would accept fair terms for African rare earths because strategic autonomy is worth paying for, and fair terms doesn't mean prohibitively expensive. It just means not exploitatively cheap. But African nations never tested this leverage because they were convinced they had no leverage, that they needed foreign investment more than foreign companies needed African resources. That conviction was always false, a psychological remnant of colonialism that persisted because it served foreign interests to maintain it. The International Energy Agency estimates that meeting climate targets will require 80 new copper mines, 70 new lithium mines, 70 new nickel mines, and 30 new cobalt mines by 2030. Many of these mines will need to be in Africa because that's where the minerals are. The clean energy transition that Western governments claim is existential to avoid catastrophic climate change literally cannot proceed without African minerals at massive scale. Yet Western companies and governments seem to believe they can open these mines under the same terms that prevailed in the 20th century. Minimal African ownership, maximum profit extraction, processing done elsewhere, value captured abroad. They seem to believe that Africa's urgency for development will override Africa's demand for fair terms, that African nations can be pressured or enticed into accepting exploitative agreements in exchange for immediate revenue and employment. They are wrong. The calculation has changed because African nations now understand that the resources are more valuable as leverage for fair terms than as immediate revenue under unfair terms. A mine that opens this year under exploitative terms might operate for 20 or 30 years, extracting resources that are gone forever, with Africa receiving a fraction of their value. A mine that opens in 3 years under fair terms, after the company initially refuses and then realizes Africa is serious, will operate for 20 or 30 years with Africa receiving appropriate value. The 3-year delay costs some immediate revenue, but it ensures decades of fair revenue, and the resources aren't going anywhere during those 3 years. They're still in African ground, still available, still valuable. This is the calculation African nations are making. Patience and firmness produce better long-term results than desperation and capitulation, the choice before the world. Because history shows us something very dangerous to empires. When the resource holder stops begging, the buyer starts listening. When the supplier realizes they have been undervaluing their product and refuses to sell at the old price, the buyer either pays the new price or goes without. When African nations collectively understand that they hold resources the world needs desperately, and they coordinate to demand fair terms, the world pays fair terms because the alternative is not having access to those resources. I am not asking Africa to isolate itself from the global economy. I am asking Africa to stand upright within that economy, to participate as an equal rather than a subordinate, to trade rather than be extracted from. Trade is welcome. Investment is welcome. Partnership is welcome. Technology transfer is welcome. Knowledge sharing is welcome. Mutual benefit is welcome. Submission is not. And to those who say, this will scare investors, let me correct you with precision. This will scare exploiters. Real investors do not fear fair terms. They fear losing unfair ones. There is a fundamental difference between investors and exploiters that often gets obscured in discussions of African development, but the distinction is crucial. Genuine investors understand that stable, mutually beneficial relationships produce better long-term returns than extractive relationships that generate resentment and eventual disruption. They recognize that paying fair prices and accepting fair terms today prevents nationalization tomorrow, that treating partners with respect creates loyalty and stability, that shared prosperity builds markets and opportunities. Genuine investors take a long-term view where African development is good for business because prosperous African nations become better trading partners, larger markets, more stable operating environments. Genuine investors recognize that the current system was unsustainable and that African nations asserting sovereignty was inevitable. Smart investors anticipated this shift and positioned themselves accordingly. They built genuine relationships with African partners. They accepted terms that respected African interests. They invested in African capacity building and local development. When the shift came, they were ready because they had already moved beyond exploitation toward partnership. But many of the companies currently operating in Africa aren't genuine investors in that sense. They're extractors optimizing for maximum short-term profit, planning to pull out when the easily accessible deposits are exhausted, treating African resources as opportunities for wealth extraction rather than development partnerships. These companies calculate return on investment over 5 or 10-year horizons, not 20 or 30-year horizons. They structure operations to minimize what stays in Africa and maximize what leaves. These companies will leave Africa when terms become fair, and that departure will be no loss because they were never truly partners to begin with. They were exploiters who served their own interests exclusively while claiming to serve African development. Their departure creates space for genuine investors who understand that Africa's future is worth investing in on terms that respect African sovereignty. Other companies, companies with longer time horizons, companies willing to accept fair terms, companies that understand that prosperity in African communities means stable business environments and growing markets, these companies will adapt. They will negotiate new agreements based on mutual respect. They will invest in African processing capacity because they understand that controlling the entire value chain isn't essential to profitability, that partnering with African processors can work if the partnership is genuine. They will hire African executives not as tokens but as genuine leaders because they recognize that local knowledge and relationships are valuable. They will pay fair royalties because they understand that fair payment creates stable relationships. And they will profit, though perhaps not at the exploitative rates they previously enjoyed. A 15% profit margin on a fair contract is better than a 30% profit margin on an exploitative contract that gets nationalized, canceled, or renegotiated under pressure. Sustainable profit is better than maximum profit. Long-term stability is better than short-term extraction. This is what fair terms mean in practice. Companies can still profit from African resources, but they cannot extract extreme profits that impoverish Africa while enriching themselves. They can still build successful businesses, but those businesses must create genuine value for African partners, not just for foreign shareholders. They can still access African minerals, but that access requires respecting African sovereignty, accepting African ownership stakes, building African capacity, and sharing African prosperity. These are not unreasonable demands. They are the baseline expectations of any fair economic relationship. The fact that they seem unreasonable reveals how distorted the previous system was. Beyond silver, I did not close these mines to start a war. I closed them to end a lie. The lie that Africa needs the West more than the West needs Africa. The lie that African resources are only valuable when Western companies control them. The lie that sovereignty over one's own natural resources is somehow economically irresponsible or politically naive. The lie that African poverty in the midst of resource wealth is natural or inevitable, rather than deliberately constructed through extractive systems. These lies have sustained neo-colonial extraction for decades, and ending them requires actions that demonstrate their falsity. Words alone don't end lies that are backed by billions in investment and centuries of practice. Actions end lies. Closing these mines is an action that demonstrates Africa's willingness to forgo revenue under exploitative terms rather than continue accepting exploitation. That willingness shifts every calculation. The Democratic Republic of Congo's cobalt export quotas proved this lie false in dramatic fashion. When the DRC announced its initial export ban in February 2025, analysts predicted catastrophic disruptions to global battery supply chains. Electric vehicle manufacturers warned of production delays that would undermine climate goals. Battery companies scrambled for alternative sources that largely didn't exist at scale. Cobalt prices spiked as markets priced in potential shortages. International pressure on the DRC was immediate and intense. Phone calls from capitals, ambassadors requesting meetings, warnings about economic consequences. But the DRC didn't blink. They maintained the ban for 8 months, forcing a global reckoning with how dependent modern technology had become on Congolese cobalt extracted under terms that benefited the DRC minimally. Global supply chains adapted, drawing down inventories, stretching existing supplies, accelerating research into cobalt-free alternatives that were still years away from commercialization. Electric vehicle production continued, but at tighter margins. Battery manufacturers negotiated directly with the DRC government rather than through intermediaries. When the DRC finally lifted the ban in September 2025 and implemented the quota system instead, it was on terms the DRC set, terms that guaranteed the government far more revenue through higher royalties, far more control through quota allocations and compliance certificates, and far more say in how the country's most valuable resource was exploited. The global supply chains didn't collapse, they adjusted. Cobalt flowed again, but under a new framework where the DRC exercised sovereignty rather than simply providing access. The 8-month ban cost the DRC some revenue from cobalt exports, but it demonstrated that the DRC could withstand that cost, that global supply chains needed Congolese cobalt more than the DRC needed immediate revenue on exploitative terms, that patience and firmness produced a better outcome than capitulation. Every African nation with valuable resources watched and learned. Leverage is real, and using it works. Mali's recovery of $1.2 billion in unpaid taxes told the same story from a different angle. When Mali announced the figure and the new mining code that would prevent such underpayment in the future, international mining analysts warned that Mali was deterring investment and would see an exodus of mining companies. Mining executives called the new code confiscatory and unreasonable. Industry associations lobbied Western governments to pressure Mali to reconsider. Instead, what happened was a renegotiation. Companies that wanted to continue operating in Mali signed new agreements under the new code, because operating in Mali under fair terms was still profitable, just less extremely profitable than before. Companies that refused to accept fair terms left, But their departure didn't crater Mali's mining sector. Their mines didn't stay closed. They were acquired by other operators willing to work under the new framework, including state-owned companies from other African nations and companies from China and other countries that understood the terms were reasonable and that access to Mali's gold was worth accepting Mali's sovereignty. Mali's mining sector continued operating, now generating far more revenue for the Malian government, and Mali demonstrated something crucial to other African nations: that insisting on fair terms doesn't destroy your mining sector, it transforms it into something that actually benefits your people. The final reckoning. The signature is dry. The order is active. The mines are closed. And Africa stands waiting, not in supplication, but in sovereignty. The world will adjust because it must. The minerals remain in African soil. The leverage remains in African hands. The future remains African to right. Those who come correct will find partnership. Those who demand submission will find closed doors. This is not the end of anything except exploitation. It is the beginning of what should have always been: genuine partnership built on mutual respect, fair terms reflecting true value, and shared prosperity replacing one-sided extraction. History has moved on. It did not ask permission. It will not wait for approval. The choice now belongs to those who need what Africa has. Come as partners, or do not come at all. Africa has spoken.